Elias Vane sat in the middle seat of row 34 with his knees pressed against the seat back in front of him, his unshaven face streaked with tears that fell silently onto the frayed collar of a denim jacket that had seen better decades. Clutched against his chest was a worn leather satchel, its edges softened by years of handling and its surface marked with the kind of patina that only comes from being held too tightly during moments of unbearable sorrow. The hum of the engines filled the economy cabin with a constant droning that swallowed the small sounds of other passengers, the rustle of pretzel bags and the intermittent coughs of a man across the aisle. Yet Elias heard none of it, lost instead in a grief so complete it seemed to have its own gravity, pulling everything else into orbit around the void where his daughter had once lived. 5 years had passed since he buried Sophie, 5 years of accumulating wealth that could purchase nations, fund governments, and reshape economies. Yet on this particular afternoon, he could not secure the one thing she had asked for in the final weeks of her illness, a window seat where the clouds appeared to cradle the plane in soft, white arms. Through a blocked view and the bobbing heads of other travelers, he stared at nothing, and the voice of his own memory whispered through the chambers of his mind that he was taking her to the ocean she never got to see, and he could not even keep the seat she had picked with the careful deliberation of a child who believed that airplanes were magic. Just 10 minutes before this moment, Elias had been sitting in seat 1A of the first-class cabin, where the lights were bright and the champagne flutes caught the overhead lamps like cut crystal scattered across linen tablecloths. Maggie Doyle, the lead flight attendant on this transcontinental route and a woman who had learned to weaponize politeness out of sheer survival, stood over him with her arms crossed and her eyes sharp with the particular exhaustion of someone who had already given too much of herself before the plane even left the ground. She looked at his frayed jacket, his unkempt hair, and the satchel in his lap, and she made a calculation in an instant, a judgment based on appearance and assumption that would alter both of their lives in ways she could not yet imagine. Her voice when she spoke carried the cadence of courtesy but the edge of absolute authority, and she told him that the seat had been reassigned and that he needed to gather his things immediately. Elias looked up at her, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights and the permanent ache of loss that had replaced every other emotion in his repertoire, and he tried to explain that his daughter had chosen this seat, that he had paid for it, that it mattered in ways she could not possibly understand, because the seat was not leather and legroom to him, but a memorial. Maggie did not let him finish. She cut him off, raising her volume just enough for the surrounding passengers to hear clearly, and told him that he did not belong here, a phrase that echoed in the cabin with a finality that summoned security guards to flank him on both sides, while passengers began pulling out their phones to capture the spectacle of a man being removed from a place where everyone had already decided he was worthless. Now, in the cramped silence of economy, Elias pressed his forehead against the cool plastic of the window shade and closed his eyes, though the shade was closed and there was nothing to see but the darkness behind his own eyelids. The reality of what had occurred settled over him with the weight of a second burial, a second goodbye, a second failure to protect the one thing that had mattered most to his child. He possessed enough money to purchase the airline outright, to buy the manufacturer of the plane, to fund entire fleets and the cities that built them. Yet he had not spoken a single word in his own defense when Maggie Doyle had demanded he leave. The question that would later haunt everyone who heard this story hung in the stale cabin air like smoke, invisible but choking in its implications. Why hadn't he simply shown them his bank account, flashed the credentials of his empire, or demanded the deference that his net worth had earned in boardrooms across the globe where men twice his age stood when he entered the room? The answer was not simple, nor was it rooted in the logic of commerce or power or the strategic withholding of information for some later gain. It was rooted in a bedroom in a penthouse apartment that had been preserved under a sheet for 5 years, in a red knitted glove that rested in his jacket lining, and in the crushing belief that no amount of money could restore what had been taken from him, which meant that no amount of money could buy back his dignity when the world had already decided he was nothing. Before I continue our story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What you are about to witness is not a story of revenge against a woman who made a terrible mistake, nor is it a tale of corporate retribution or public shaming designed to satisfy some appetite for justice. This is a psychological journey through the landscape of grief, a place where the maps are wrong and the compass points inward, where the terrain shifts beneath your feet and what looks like solid ground turns out to be memory, fragile and treacherous. The last 5 minutes of this story will break you in a way you do not see coming, not through violence or scandal or some dramatic confrontation where the billionaire reveals himself and the flight attendant falls to her knees in a Hollywood moment of regret. Stay with us until the end, because the seat that was taken from him was never really about first class, and the man who gave it away was carrying a burden that no security guard could have imagined, and no passenger could have perceived from the outside. To understand why a trillionaire would allow himself to be dragged from a first-class seat without uttering a word of protest, one must first step into the world Elias had constructed from the wreckage of his former life, a life that had ended not with his own death, but with Sophie's. His penthouse apartment occupied the top 3 floors of a building he owned in the financial district, yet every room beyond the foyer sat empty, the furniture shrouded in white sheets that turned the space into a museum of abandoned potential, a mausoleum of couches and chairs that no one would ever sit in again. The only room that remained alive, if such a word can be applied to a place frozen in time like a photograph that has forgotten how to move, was Sophie's bedroom, where her books still stood on the shelf in the order she had left them, where her blankets retained the faint impression of her small body, and where the window faced east toward an ocean she had never lived to see, but had described in such detail from her hospital bed that Elias could no longer distinguish her imagination from his memory. Elias dressed each morning in clothes that had been old before she died, deliberately choosing a denim jacket with frayed cuffs and a scarf that had belonged to his late wife, because wearing the trappings of wealth felt like a betrayal to the memory of a little girl who had never cared about money, who had once told him that rich people smelled like the plastic wrapping on new toys, and who had preferred the scent of library books and rain. In the pocket of that jacket, he carried her red knitted glove, a relic of a winter afternoon when she had lost its mate in the hospital garden, and he had promised to find it, a promise that now served as his only tether to the texture of her existence, the physical proof that she had once been small enough to wear something so delicate. He had not washed the jacket in 5 years, not because he was unclean, but because he feared that the dry cleaning chemicals would erase the last molecules of her scent that might still cling to the wool, a phantom olfactory connection that he could not bear to sever. On the morning of the flight, he had refused his chauffeur and the private car that waited in the underground garage, choosing instead to take public transit to the airport, where he could disappear into the anonymity of crowds that did not know his name or net worth, or the fact that he had not attended a board meeting in 3 years, despite still being listed as the chief executive of a dozen multinational corporations. He walked through the terminal with his satchel clutched before him like a shield, passing the luxury boutiques and the gleaming bars where executives laughed over expense account drinks, and he stopped only once at an airport toy store where a stuffed rabbit sat in the window wearing a plaid vest that Sophie would have found ridiculous, therefore essential. For a full minute, Elias stood before the glass with his hand pressed against the reflection of the toy, his breath fogging the surface in small, rhythmic clouds that matched the pattern of his breathing, which had become shallow and careful, as if he were trying to prevent some internal structure from collapsing. Sophie had loved rabbits, had named every stuffed animal she owned after flowers, and had once declared that if she ever met a real rabbit, she would name it Dandelion and teach it to sleep in her bed. A declaration made during the early months of her illness, when such dreams still seemed possible. Then Elias walked away, because buying the rabbit would mean acknowledging that she was not there to receive it, and some griefs are too precise to be disturbed by sentiment, too carefully balanced to risk the addition of a new object that would only emphasize the absence it was intended to fill. His voice, had anyone been close enough to hear it over the terminal announcements and the rolling suitcases, might have explained that Sophie had said first class smelled like fake flowers, but that the window by the wing was where the clouds hugged the plane, a phrase she had invented at 6 years old and which he had carried like scripture ever since, repeating it to himself in moments when the alternative was silence. While Elias was making his way through the anonymous arteries of the airport, Maggie Doyle was waking to the sound of her 4 a.m. alarm in a tiny apartment on the other side of the city, where the walls were thin and the refrigerator hummed with a desperation that matched her own. She moved quietly through the darkness, careful not to wake her son, Tommy, who slept in the adjacent bedroom with a nasal cannula feeding oxygen into his lungs and a pulse oximeter clipped to his finger, its green glow the only light in the room and the only color in a space that had long since surrendered to the beige and gray of medical necessity. Tommy was 9 years old, though his illness had aged him in ways that showed in the hollows of his cheeks and the careful way he breathed, as if each inhalation were a negotiation with a body that had forgotten its original purpose. And Maggie had learned to read the rhythm of his sleep before she read her own face in the mirror, because his survival depended on her vigilance in ways that her own did not. On the refrigerator, held by magnets shaped like airplanes that had been gifts from well-meaning relatives, were photos of Tommy in a hospital gown, smiling weakly beside another child whose face was turned away in the photograph, wearing a bright red scarf that seemed to burn against the clinical white of the background like a warning or a beacon. Maggie pinned her uniform to her chest, practiced the smile that the airline required for first-class service, and then let it collapse in the privacy of her bathroom, because maintaining the illusion of hospitality for passengers who treated her like furniture was a performance that demanded all the energy she had left after a night of listening to Tommy's breathing stutter and pause. She owed $40,000 in medical debt, a figure that grew monthly despite the payments she made by skipping meals and working double shifts that left her feet swollen and her temper frayed to the point of transparency. She had come to believe through the slow erosion of hope and the constant battering of bills that the world was divided cleanly between people who mattered and people who simply took up space, and she had placed herself firmly in the latter category as a defense mechanism, assuming that everyone she met would eventually disappoint her or demand something she could not give. This worldview had not made her cruel, exactly, but it had made her efficient, capable of making snap judgments about who deserved her limited reserves of compassion and who did not. And when she looked at Elias Vane in the gate area, she saw a man who had given up on himself, which meant in her calculus that he had forfeited any claim to her protection. As Maggie poured coffee into a chipped mug that had been a gift from her mother before the diagnosis, before the hospital became their second home, her phone buzzed with a news notification that she glanced at and immediately scrolled past, her thumb moving with the automatic dismissal of someone who had no room left for information that did not directly impact her survival or Tommy's next appointment. The headline, had she paused to read it for even 3 seconds, would have informed her that the trillionaire recluse Elias Vane had donated $300 million to pediatric oncology, a gift that had been made anonymously through his foundation and only recently attributed to him by financial journalists who tracked the movements of capital the way ornithologists tracked rare birds, with patience and a kind of reverence that Maggie no longer possessed for anything except her son's next breath. She did not read it because she had no time for the charitable gestures of the wealthy, no faith that such generosity would ever trickle down to the empty space beneath the kitchen sink where she kept the bills she could not pay in a shoebox that once held Tommy's baby shoes. She checked Tommy's breathing one last time, adjusted the cannula where it had slipped against his cheek, and left for the airport with the weight of her son's illness strapped to her chest like a second heart that beat only in fear and debt. At the gate, the convergence of these two lives was set in motion not by fate, but by the mundane machinery of airline bureaucracy and the casual cruelty of those who mistake status for worth, who believe that a person's value can be determined by their luggage or the shine on their shoes. Maggie was pulled aside by her supervisor, a woman who spoke in the clipped tones of someone managing a crisis that was entirely manufactured, and informed that a VIP passenger required immediate accommodation that could not be refused. Dr. Richard Hale, a celebrity surgeon and social media influencer whose arrogance was as carefully cultivated as his surgical skill and whose online following numbered in the millions, had booked a first-class ticket but demanded the specific window seat in 1A for a wellness livestream he intended to broadcast to his followers from 30,000 feet. The passenger currently assigned to that seat, the system indicated, had booked through a legacy account and had not updated his profile photograph in over a decade. His appearance at the gate, unshaven and carrying a worn satchel, did not match the financial value the airline associated with the seat, and the algorithm had flagged him as non-priority. Maggie was not explicitly told to remove him, but the implication hung in the fluorescent buzz of the gate area, a suggestion wrapped in the language of priority and medical necessity that she did not question because she had learned that questioning supervisors led to reduced hours, and reduced hours led to gaps in insurance coverage. She saw Elias sitting alone near the windows, his satchel on his lap, staring at the tarmac with the vacant intensity of a man watching a memory rather than a runway, and she made her judgment before she ever reached him, before she ever spoke a word or checked the details of his booking beyond the flag in the system. He looked, to her exhausted eyes, like the kind of man who had stumbled into a place he did not belong, perhaps a veteran down on his luck or a grieving widower who had spent his last dollars on a seat he could not afford, and she assigned him to the category of people who took up space that others had paid to occupy. This was not a decision she made with malice, but with the brutal efficiency of someone who had learned that empathy was a luxury she could not afford, a finite resource that had to be rationed for Tommy and Tommy alone. She straightened her jacket, fixed her smile, and prepared to handle the situation with the professionalism that her supervisor expected, unaware that the man she was about to humiliate had funded the experimental treatments that had kept her son alive through the winter, unaware that the eyes she found so hollow had once watched a little girl draw pictures of airplanes while attached to IV poles. When boarding began, Elias walked down the jet bridge with the slow deliberation of a man attending a service rather than a flight, his hand running along the smooth interior wall of the plane, as if confirming its solidity, as if reassuring himself that this vessel could actually carry him to the place where he had promised to take his daughter. He found seat 1A and paused before sitting, his fingers tracing the leather armrest, the window shade, the small pocket where magazines were kept, treating each surface with the attention of someone memorizing a sacred space. For a moment, his expression softened into something that approached peace, a loosening of the facial muscles that had been clenched for 5 years, and he whispered words that were lost to the ambient noise of the cabin, but which would later be remembered by a passenger in the row behind him as the most private prayer she had ever witnessed in a public place. He said he was here, baby, and he placed the satchel carefully in his lap before opening the window shade to reveal a sky that had turned golden with the afternoon light, the clouds gathering in formations that Sophie had once compared to cotton candy castles, and Elias almost smiled, the muscles of his face twitching with the unfamiliar motion of happiness before Maggie Doyle marched down the aisle toward him with 2 security guards in her wake. Maggie arrived at row 1 and stood over Elias with the same posture she had practiced in her bathroom mirror that morning, her arms crossed, her voice carrying the polished edge of authority that the airline trained into its senior staff for exactly these moments of extraction. She asked for his ticket and he produced it without argument, the paper creased from being held too long in a shaking hand that once signed documents worth billions.
She frowned at the name, at the legacy account code, and she told her there had been a manifest error, that the seat was needed for a medical priority passenger, though she did not specify what medical condition required a window seat for a live stream, and she did not check whether the passenger in question was actually a doctor or simply played one on the internet. Elias looked up at her, and in his eyes was not anger, but a plea so raw that it should have stopped her, a father's voice explaining that his daughter had chosen this place, that it mattered because she mattered, that the money was irrelevant because the seat was a promise. Maggie did not check the system beyond the initial flag. She did not ask for clarification or consider that the man before her might have paid for this seat with something more valuable than money, which was the memory of a child who had believed that clouds could be touched from an airplane window.
When Elias remained seated, paralyzed by the sudden collision of his grief with her authority, she unclipped his seatbelt herself and stepped back to give the security guards room to work, her movements efficient and impersonal. Dr. Hale stood in the aisle with his phone raised, filming the encounter with a smirk that he intended to broadcast later as evidence of his own importance, commenting to his followers in a voice loud enough for the cabin to hear that first class was not for everyone and that some people needed to learn their place in the hierarchy of modern travel. Elias stood slowly, his movements those of a man underwater, and as he rose, a child's crayon drawing slipped from his satchel and fluttered toward the carpeted floor, spinning in the air for a moment that seemed to stretch into minutes. Maggie, focused on the task of clearing the seat for her VIP, stepped on it without looking, her heel grinding the paper into the fibers as she gestured for Elias to move, not out of cruelty, but out of blindness, out of a refusal to see the humanity in front of her, because seeing it would have required more than she had to give. He did not yell. He did not fight or demand to see a manager or threaten legal action that he could have executed with a single phone call to an army of attorneys who would have grounded the flight and destroyed careers before sunset. He knelt down in front of everyone, in front of the phones and the smirking surgeon and the curious eyes of the wealthy who had already begun composing their social media posts, and he carefully smoothed the drawing with trembling fingers, folding it with a precision that suggested it was a religious text or a map to buried treasure, and tucked it into his breast pocket over his heart. Then he looked at the seat one last time, not as a piece of real estate, but as a person he was leaving behind, and he allowed the guards to escort him back to the economy cabin with a gentleness that suggested they were more confused by his compliance than they would have been by resistance. In economy, he was squeezed between a talkative salesman who immediately began complaining about his quarterly targets and an elderly woman named Doris who sat by the window with the quiet composure of someone who had seen enough of life to recognize suffering when it sat beside her, and who understood that some silences were not rude but necessary. Elias hugged the satchel to his chest and said nothing, his eyes fixed on the back of the seat in front of him, where a safety card depicted calm passengers exiting a plane that would never crash, a fiction that seemed almost offensive in its optimism. The salesman finally noticed the wooden edge of the urn peeking from the satchel and fell silent, turning away with the embarrassed discomfort of someone who had stumbled into a funeral without an invitation, while Doris placed a tissue on the shared armrest without comment, an offering that Elias did not take, but acknowledged with a blink that released 2 more tears down his weathered cheeks. It was not until the plane had reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign had dinged off that Elias opened the satchel with the reverence of a priest handling communion, revealing the small wooden urn nestled between folded documents and the child's drawing he had rescued, and beside it a silver locket that caught the dim cabin light with a dull gleam. He opened the locket with a thumb that had developed a callus from this exact motion, repeated thousands of times in empty rooms and silent cars, and inside was a photograph of Sophie, her hair wild from chemotherapy, her smile missing 2 front teeth, her eyes bright with a life that had burned too briefly to leave ash, but had left instead this image and the man who carried it. For the next 90 minutes, Elias existed in a silence so complete it seemed to generate its own atmosphere, a bubble of grief that separated him from the rustle of peanut bags, the crying of a baby 3 rows back,
and the constant roar of engines that pressed against the fuselage like a physical weight trying to crush the cabin into the clouds below. He stared at the seatback tray, which bore the scratches and graffiti of 1,000 anonymous travelers, and he saw none of it, his mind instead traversing the preserved bedroom in his empty penthouse, the toy store rabbit he had not purchased, and the ocean that waited on the other side of this flight like a promise he was no longer sure he deserved to keep because he had failed so completely at the smaller promises. The rain began to streak the tiny economy window, thin rivers of water that divided the glass into fragments, and Elias pressed his forehead against the cool plastic, letting the vibration of the plane travel through his skull and into the hollow space where his thoughts echoed without answer. He had built a $1 trillion empire trying to hold everything together, to control the variables of a universe that had proven itself indifferent to his love. And yet here he was, unable to keep a single airplane seat warm for 5 minutes, unable to protect his daughter's last wish from the heel of a stranger's shoe, and the absurdity of this failure sat upon his chest like a stone. In the first-class cabin, Maggie Doyle found herself unable to look directly at Dr. Hale, whose demands had escalated from champagne to complaints about the temperature, the lighting, and the insufficient enthusiasm of her smile, which she seemed to view as a personal insult to his importance. He snapped his fingers for service as if she were a pet or a device that had malfunctioned, and each time she turned to respond, she saw instead the face of Elias Vane, not angry, not resistant, but resigned, with a resignation that suggested he had already lost everything worth fighting for, and had simply been waiting for the world to confirm what he already knew about his own worthlessness. She retreated to the galley under the pretense of restocking napkins, and there, surrounded by the mechanical hum of refrigeration and the smell of instant coffee that never quite dissolved in the water, she pulled out her phone with hands that had begun to shake without her permission. She opened the news notification she had ignored that morning, the one about the pediatric oncology donation, and this time she read the headline, then the article, then she scrolled to the photograph of Elias Vane, and the face was cleaner in the image, the hair shorter and professionally styled, the suit worth more than her annual salary, but the eyes were unmistakable. They were the same hollow, devastated eyes that had looked up at her in seat 1A and tried to explain about her daughter, the same eyes that had not threatened or demanded, but had simply pleaded for understanding that she had refused to grant. Her blood ran cold, a literal sensation of ice flooding her veins and freezing her breath in her throat, and she looked at the photograph on her lock screen, Tommy sleeping with his cannula glowing green against the darkness of his room, then back at the billionaire she had publicly humiliated. The phone slipped in her sweating palm, clattering against the metal counter of the galley, and she did not pick it up immediately because she was too busy trying to breathe, too busy trying to reconcile the man in the photograph with the man she had stepped over, the man whose drawing she had ground beneath her heel. The article mentioned his daughter, Sophie, who had died 5 years ago of the same illness that Tommy was fighting, and Maggie felt the floor of the galley tilt beneath her feet as the first threads of connection began to weave themselves into a pattern she did not yet understand but already feared. She rushed back to first class with an urgency that bordered on panic, ignoring Hale's lifted hand and demanding voice, and she reached into the seat pocket of 1A where the small envelope still waited, like an accusation or a gift she had not earned. She tore it open with teeth and fingers that had lost their fine motor control, and inside was a crayon drawing that made her knees buckle beneath her and sent her crashing against the adjacent seat. 2 children held hands beneath an airplane that floated in a sky of purple and orange, one child with a red scarf, the other with a bow in her hair, and on the back, in the wobbly letters of a child who had learned to write in a hospital bed between doses of medication that burned and nurses who whispered, were the words, "Sophie plus Tommy, best friends. Don't be scared, Tommy. The clouds are soft." Maggie collapsed against the galley wall, the drawing pressed to her chest, because Tommy's best friend in the hospital, the little girl who had died 5 years ago, and whose absence he still spoke of in his sleep, with a reverence that broke Maggie's heart anew each time, had been Sophie Vane. And the man she had treated like garbage, the man whose drawing she had stepped on and whose daughter's last message she had ignored, was the anonymous donor whose foundation had paid for Tommy's experimental treatments, the surgeries that had kept him alive long enough to reach 9 years old and to keep breathing through the nights when Maggie had been certain he would stop. With a sob that she could not suppress, a sound that originated somewhere below her stomach and tore through her chest with the force of a physical object, Maggie ran down the aisle toward Economy, her polished composure shattered, her uniform askew, her face contorted in a mask of horror and grief that caused passengers to turn and stare as if she were a passenger having a medical emergency. She reached row 34 and found only the talkative salesman and the elderly woman, the middle seat empty, the satchel gone, the absence so complete that it seemed to hum with its own frequency. She grabbed the salesman's arm with a strength that surprised them both and demanded to know where he was, her voice cracking into a scream that echoed in the sudden quiet of the cabin. The salesman, alarmed by her disheveled appearance and desperate eyes, stammered that he thought the man had gone to the bathroom, that he had been gone for a few minutes, that the lady should calm down. Maggie was not calm. She could not be calm. She sobbed into her hands in the aisle of the economy cabin, the crayon drawing clutched in her fist, while Doris watched her with the same quiet knowing she had shown earlier, and the other passengers began to whisper among themselves about the flight attendant who had apparently lost her mind at 30,000 feet, unaware that she had instead found it, too late and too brutally. Maggie found Elias in the aft galley, standing before a tiny porthole that offered a view of nothing but cloud cover and the gray sheen of the sky beyond, a portal to emptiness that seemed appropriate to his posture. He did not turn when she approached, did not react to her footsteps or her ragged breathing, or the hitching sobs that she tried to suppress behind her teeth, and for a moment she thought he might be sleepwalking through his own nightmare, a man so broken that the external world had ceased to register, and she was simply another sound in the white noise of his grief. She tried to speak, to form the words of apology and recognition that were backing up in her throat like floodwater behind a dam that was failing, but nothing came out except a strangled sound that was half gasp, half sob, a primitive noise of distress that no language could have improved upon. Finally, she managed to tell him that his daughter had known her son, that Sophie had been Tommy's best friend in the hospital, and she held out the drawing with both hands as if it were a sacred object she was returning to its rightful temple, though she felt like a thief returning stolen goods rather than a messenger delivering news.
Elias turned slowly, and his face, when he saw the drawing, did not harden with the rage she deserved, or the contempt that would have been justified. Instead, it opened, the mask of grief slipping, to reveal a vulnerability so profound that it seemed to fill the small galley and press against the walls, displacing the air and making it difficult for either of them to breathe. Tears fell from his eyes without blinking, as if his body had decided that the usual protocols of facial control were no longer necessary, and he whispered Tommy's name with a tenderness that suggested he had been waiting years to speak it aloud. He identified him immediately as the boy with the dinosaur socks, recalling that Sophie had talked about him until the very end, insisting that he was braver than she was, that he deserved the treatments that were coming too late for her, but just in time for him, and that she wanted her father to make sure he was not scared. Maggie fell to her knees in the aisle, the drawing clutched against her chest, and she tried to apologize, to explain that she had not known, that she had been told to handle the situation, that she had been cruel because she was tired and scared, and convinced that the world was made only of predators and prey, and that she had to be the predator to survive. Elias knelt with her, not to comfort her with a hand on her shoulder, but to place the drawing gently in her trembling fingers, and to tell her the truth that he had never spoken aloud to anyone, not to his therapists, not to his board members, not to the empty rooms of his penthouse. He explained that he had not paid for Tommy's medicine because he was good or noble or seeking redemption through the gratitude of strangers. He had paid for it because he had failed Sophie,
because the drug that could have saved her had come 17 minutes too late, and because he had missed her last breath by exactly that margin of time, a temporal distance that measured the collapse of his entire universe. He revealed the locket, opening it to show not just Sophie's photograph, but the hospital bracelet tucked behind it, the date of her death printed in the impersonal font of medical administration, the time stamped at 3:14 p.m. on an autumn afternoon that had been sunny and cruel in its beauty. He had been in a boardroom 3 miles away, signing the funding papers that would have paid for her treatment, and the final signature had been executed at 3:31 p.m., 17 minutes after she had exhaled for the last time without him there to catch it. The real tragedy, he told her, was not that he was a trillionaire who had been thrown out of first class by a woman who did not recognize him. It was that he had bought the cure for every child except his own, and he had missed with death to do it, trading his presence at her bedside for the hope that money could manufacture a future that had already been foreclosed. The cabin around them had gone quiet, passengers standing in their seats to watch the scene unfolding at the back of the plane, though neither Elias nor Maggie noticed them, because they were enclosed in a confession booth made of aluminum and grief. Doris stood in the aisle, having followed Maggie, and her presence seemed to anchor the moment in a reality that was stranger than fiction, a witness to the kind of truth that people read about in novels but rarely see in the galley of a commercial airliner. Maggie, broken and weeping, looked up at Elias and asked the question that everyone would later ask when this story spread across the internet and the news cycles, and the quiet conversations of people trying to understand what they would have done in his place. Why hadn't he told her who he was?
Why hadn't he stopped her, shown his bank account, demanded the respect that his wealth commanded, and saved himself from the humiliation that had been captured on a dozen phones and would eventually be dissected by millions? Elias smiled then, and it was a smile so devastating in its gentleness that Maggie felt her heart crack along a fault line she had not known existed, a fracture that would never fully heal, but might one day allow something new to grow. He told her that who he was did not matter, that his name and his money and his empire were ashes in comparison to the only identity that had ever meant anything to him, Sophie's father. The seat was not his to keep, he explained, because Sophie had taught him that the world was not divided into those who mattered and those who took up space, but into those who were kind and those who were frightened, and sometimes they were the same people wearing different masks. He had lost her seat not because he was weak, but because fighting for it would have meant becoming the kind of man who valued a chair more than a broken stranger's dignity, and he had already lost enough of himself to grief without losing that. As he spoke, the rain on the window stopped, and a single beam of sunset cut through the clouds and landed on the drawing in Maggie's hands, illuminating the purple sky and the 2 children holding hands beneath the airplane with a light that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the physical sun. The light held them both in its warmth, and for a moment the galley was silent except for the sound of Maggie's weeping and the steady hum of the engines that carried them toward a destination that suddenly seemed less important in the journey they had just shared. Elias stood slowly, his knees aching from the position, and he looked at the drawing one last time before closing Maggie's fingers over it. He told her to give Tommy his best, to tell him that Sophie still believed he was the bravest boy she had ever known, and then he walked past her toward the main cabin with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who had finished a long and terrible journey and was not sure what came after. As the plane began its descent and the captain announced the landing approach, Maggie found Elias in the economy cabin and begged him to return to seat 1A for deplaning, to reclaim what had been taken from him, and to allow her some small measure of restitution that might begin to balance the scales. Elias refused. He told her that Sophie had never cared about first class or the champagne or the wider seats that converted into beds, that she had cared only about the clouds and the wing and the feeling that the plane was holding the sky together so that it would not fall on the heads of the people she loved. He could see the clouds just fine from row 34, he said, and the view did not improve with leather upholstery or the absence of neighbors who talked too loudly about their quarterly targets. Dr. Hale walked past them then, still oblivious to the earthquake that had occurred in the aft galley, bragging into his phone about his groundbreaking live stream and the importance of his personal brand, the window seat behind him already forgotten as he planned his next post. Elias watched him go with no rage in his eyes, only a pity that was genuine and complete, because he recognized in the surgeon a man who needed the seat more than he did, a man who had to perform being important because he had never learned how to simply be, and who would never understand that the best view in the world could not fill a hole that had been dug by loneliness. As the passengers began to gather their belongings and the cabin filled with the mechanical sounds of preparation and the rustle of coats being retrieved from overhead bins, Maggie noticed something on Elias's jacket sleeve that she had missed before, a faded patch from a homeless shelter, a place where she had volunteered in the years before Tommy's diagnosis, back when she had still believed that kindness was a currency that could protect her from misfortune, and that good deeds were accumulated like savings in a moral bank account. She realized then that Elias had not simply been grieving in the abstract manner of the wealthy, surrounded by luxury and preserved bedrooms and the insulated silence of money. He had been living in the margins of his own empire, wearing discarded clothes, taking public transit, erasing himself from the narrative of his own success because he believed he did not deserve comfort, that comfort was a language he had lost the right to speak when he had failed to sign the papers in time to save his daughter. The patch was not a fashion statement or a gesture of solidarity designed to impress. It was evidence of a man who had tried to punish himself for surviving his daughter, who had reduced his existence to the barest minimum because every pleasure felt like a betrayal to her memory, every soft bed an insult to the hardness of the ground where she lay. In the final moments before the seatbelt sign illuminated for landing, Elias reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the crushed drawing that Maggie had stepped on in first class, the paper now creased and torn along the edges where her heel had pressed it into the carpet, damaged but not destroyed. He held it out to her and she took it with both hands, expecting another artifact of Sophie's imagination, another crayon rendering of clouds and airplanes and the bright, impossible colors that children use when they have not yet learned that the sky is usually blue and nothing more. But as she smoothed it against her thighs, she saw that it was not merely a drawing. It was a letter, written in crayon in the shaky hand of a child who had known she was dying and who had wanted to leave something good behind, a final instruction to the father she would not see grow old. Sophie had written that if someone needed your seat more than you should give it to them, even if they were mean, especially if they were mean, because people who were mean were usually just scared, and scared people needed soft places to land more than anyone else. Elias had read this letter 1,000 times in the 5 years since her death, had memorized the wobble of each letter and the way the orange crayon had run out of pigment halfway through the word clouds, and he had known the moment Maggie Doyle approached him with her arms crossed and her voice sharpened by exhaustion that he could have stopped her. He could have shown her the truth of his wealth and watched her crumble in apology, could have had her removed from the flight or the airline or the industry, could have made her feel the same smallness she had inflicted upon him. But he had chosen not to. Not out of weakness or passivity or some martyr complex that sought suffering for its own sake, but because his dead daughter had asked him to be kind to broken people, and Maggie Doyle was the most broken person he had encountered in a world full of suffering, a woman so fractured by fear and debt that she had forgotten how to see. Maggie read the letter and sobbed so hard that she could not stand, collapsing into the economy seat that Elias had vacated, the paper pressed against her mouth as if she could taste the wax of the crayon and the love that had guided its application. Elias walked off the plane alone, carrying the wooden urn in his satchel, his shoulders bent beneath a weight that no porter could ever lift, and as he moved down the jet bridge, the red glove in his pocket slipped out unnoticed and fell to the carpeted floor of the aircraft, lying there like a small, bright wound against the neutral ground.
Maggie, stumbling after him with the letter still in her hand, saw it and bent to retrieve it, closing her fingers around the wool with a reverence that surprised her, feeling the shape of a child's hand that had long since turned to ash, but had left behind this shell of warmth. She understood that she had been given a responsibility she had not earned and a forgiveness she did not deserve, and that the glove would have to be enough because Elias Vane would not accept her apology and she would never find the words to offer it. 6 months after that flight, Elias dissolved his public holdings, converting his empire into liquid capital that he poured into the foundation that had saved Tommy Doyle and thousands of others, removing himself from the structures of power that had kept him from his daughter's bedside. The foundation, once anonymous, now treats 40,000 children annually, its name changed to the Sophie Vane Pediatric Trust, though Elias never attends the galas or allows his photograph to be taken at the ribbon cuttings, preferring the anonymity he had cultivated in his grief. Maggie Doyle still works for the airline, though she no longer works first class, having requested a permanent assignment to economy, where she believes the real people sit with their real griefs and their small, precious hopes, and where she can be useful to those who need it most.
She keeps the red glove in her apron pocket, where her fingers find it during turbulence or difficult passengers, or moments when the exhaustion threatens to make her into the kind of woman she was on the day she met Elias Vane. And she touches it like a talisman that reminds her that every person she meets might be carrying an urn or a letter or a love that outlives the body that contained it. Tommy is 12 now. His health improved enough that he no longer needs the cannula every hour of the day, and sometimes Maggie takes him to the airport on her days off, where they sit by the windows and watch the clouds gather around the wings of departing planes, and she tells him stories about a little girl who believed the clouds were soft, and a man who gave away his seat so that a scared person could have a soft place to land. Elias Vane never asked Maggie Doyle for an apology, and she never gave him one, because some debts are too large to be settled with words, and some forgiveness is too heavy to be spoken aloud, existing instead in the spaces between actions, in the foundation that bears his daughter's name, and in the glove that travels the skies in the pocket of a woman who learned too late that kindness is the only economy that matters. If you were Elias, sitting in that first-class seat with the power to destroy careers and bankrupt airlines with a single phone call, would you have fought for the seat, demanded your place, and proven your worth to a world that measures humanity in dollars and boarding groups? Or was giving it away the only way to keep his daughter's memory alive, the only method he had left of honoring a little girl who believed the clouds were soft, and that even mean people were just frightened children wearing adult faces? Tell us in the comments below where you stand, and let us know where you're watching from, because these stories belong to all of us now, and we want to hear how they land in the places you call home. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss our upcoming videos, including next week's story about the surgeon who received a heart from the patient he accidentally killed, a tale of medical error and impossible redemption that will challenge everything you think you know about justice. Until then, remember that what a seat is worth has nothing to do with the money paid for it, and everything to do with the memory it holds. And sometimes the richest man on the plane is the one who has nothing left to lose, but still finds a way to give.